Something extraordinary is unfolding inside American power right now, and if you miss the first layer of this story, you will completely miss the reason it could shake the world, because what looks like political noise on the surface may actually be the opening move of a much bigger doctrine that is quietly rewriting the future of North America. The shocking part is not that America is being aggressive, because America has always used pressure when it wanted results. The shocking part is that this time the language is not hidden. The ambition is not subtle, and the map being drawn in Washington is so bold that it sounds almost impossible until you realize the words are coming from the highest levels of power. We are talking about a vision that stretches from Greenland in the frozen north to the Panama Canal in the south, from Canada to the Caribbean, and from energy pressure to military posturing, all wrapped inside a bigger strategy that could redefine what the world thinks the United States is trying to become. Before we move forward, I want to say something honestly. I put a lot of effort into analyzing, researching, and bringing you the latest news, but many of you don't even like the videos, don't subscribe, and don't share. I even reply to your comments regularly, yet I still don't see much response. It genuinely feels disappointing, so I sincerely request you to please support the channel. We'll follow both Market Mindset and the backup channel Market Mindset 2, and show your support through likes, shares, and comments. And that is exactly why this story matters so much, because this is not just about one speech, one headline, or one statement that people will forget tomorrow. This is about a pattern of behavior that grows more serious every time the administration moves from words into action, and once that pattern starts forming, the consequences stop being local and start becoming global. The first place to understand this is Cuba, because Cuba is not just an island. Cuba is a warning, a pressure test, and a live example of what happens when a superpower decides that economic pain is cheaper than diplomacy, and that collapse is easier to provoke than compromise. For decades, Cuba has lived under American sanctions, cut off from normal trade and forced to survive in a narrow and unforgiving space. And for years, it managed to keep going through workarounds, through support from allies, and through the basic resilience of a population that has learned to live under constant external pressure. But then the pressure suddenly sharpened, because once Venezuela's role became unstable, once the oil supply chain weakened, and once Washington began using tariffs, threats, and economic punishment as a wider weapon, the result was not just diplomatic tension, it was a direct humanitarian crisis that hit ordinary people first and hardest. When the power goes out for days, when hospitals cannot rely on surgical equipment, when transport systems begin failing, when blackouts turn daily life into a struggle, that is when global politics stops being abstract and becomes painfully physical, because people do not experience geopolitics through speeches. They experience it through heat, darkness, fear, and disruption. And here's the twist that makes the whole thing even more dangerous, because every time the United States squeezes a country like Cuba, another power sees an opening. And in this case, that opening belongs to Russia, which can step in with emergency supplies, humanitarian language, and strategic goodwill just miles from Florida. That is how influence shifts, not always through dramatic conquest, but through vacuum, dependency, and the quiet humiliation of a population trapped between pressure from one side and rescue from another, while the original target remains in place and the real winner becomes the outsider who arrives at the exact right moment. The deeper question is why this happens now, why the language is harder, why the rhetoric is broader, and why the tone from Washington feels less like ordinary diplomacy and more like a return to an older, more possessive style of power that many believed had been buried by the modern international order. One answer is that the White House appears to believe the United States is entering a new era of strategic competition, one in which China, Russia, and rising global instability mean America must secure its own hemisphere before it can worry about the rest of the world, and that idea is the foundation of what many are now calling Greater North America. That phrase sounds clean and almost academic, but the meaning behind it is explosive, because it suggests a regional sphere of influence so large, so aggressive, and so ambition-filled that it stops sounding like alliance management and starts sounding like territorial doctrine. This is where the story leaves the realm of ordinary politics and enters the realm of historical danger, because once a superpower begins speaking about neighboring sovereign territory as though it belongs inside a natural zone of control, every border in that region becomes psychologically weaker before it becomes legally threatened. Panama is the next major piece of the puzzle, because the canal is not just a waterway, it is one of the most strategically important passages on Earth, a narrow corridor through which global trade, military logistics, and economic flow all depend, and for the United States to talk about taking it back is to challenge not just Panama, but the principle of sovereign ownership itself. The canal connects the Atlantic and Pacific in a way that saves ships enormous time and cost, and that makes it one of the most valuable pieces of infrastructure in the modern world, which is exactly why even the suggestion of reclaiming it creates international alarm far beyond Central America. The official justification often centers on Chinese contracts, port influence, and strategic concern, And to be fair, those concerns are not imaginary because Chinese economic expansion across the Americas is real, but the method of response matters just as much as the concern itself. And that is where the United States begins to look reckless rather than strategic. There is a huge difference between negotiating, balancing, and building coalitions on one side, and on the other side, simply declaring that another sovereign nation's infrastructure should return to American hands. Because once that line is crossed, every ally starts asking where the boundary actually is and whether any boundary is truly safe. Canada is where the doctrine becomes especially shocking for friendly audiences, because Canada is not a rival, not an enemy, and not a distant state with no history of cooperation. Canada is one of America's closest allies, one of its deepest trading partners, and one of the most stable democratic neighbors the United States has ever had. And yet the political language around Canada has been so provocative that the idea of the country becoming the 51st state moved from being absurd satire to being repeated enough times that it began to leave a real emotional mark, because once a trusted neighbor is spoken about like a future possession, trust itself starts to crack. The Canadian response was immediate and angry, with public rejection, political unity across party lines, cultural backlash, and a growing sense that what should have been a relationship of equals was being treated like a hierarchy. And that feeling matters because alliances survive on respect long before they survive on treaties. Greenland pushes that same problem into even more dangerous territory, because Greenland is not only autonomous territory under Denmark, it is also a strategic jewel in the Arctic. And the Arctic is no longer just ice and distance, it is becoming a new frontier of military positioning, resource competition, and shipping routes that will matter more every year. When a leader openly refuses to rule out force in relation to a NATO-connected territory, the alarm is not just about Greenland itself, it is about the credibility of the entire alliance structure. Because if the United States can threaten a partner within the system it helped build, then every other partner has to wonder what protection the system actually offers. That is what makes this moment feel so different from normal political theater. Because these are not distant adversaries being bullied for domestic applause. These are allies, treaty partners, and nations that have spent decades helping shape the same world order America once claimed to defend. Now pause for a moment, because to understand why this is so dangerous, you have to understand that American expansion is not new. It is part of the country's historical memory, and the United States has expanded before through purchase, war, annexation, pressure, and carefully dressed up coercion. The Louisiana Purchase doubled the size of the young republic. Florida was acquired, Texas was annexed, the Mexican-American War redrew the map of the continent, Alaska was purchased from Russia, Hawaii was annexed, and the Panama Canal zone became a symbol of how powerful nations often treated geography as something to be managed rather than respected. Supporters of the current vision would say this is nothing more than a continuation of manifest destiny, the old belief that American growth across the continent is natural, inevitable, and justified by power, but that argument collapses when placed inside the modern world of sovereign states, international law, and nuclear deterrence. The 19th century was a brutal age of empires, and many of the acts that shaped America's rise would not survive ethical scrutiny today. But the key difference now is that the world no longer operates as a loose frontier, where raw power alone decides the map, because every modern state has identity, institutions, alliances, media, trade links, and the ability to resist in ways that old empires never had to face. That is why the Greater North America Doctrine is not just aggressive. It is historically out of sync with the world it is trying to dominate, because the tools of the past do not work cleanly in a world where every move is observed instantly, monetized immediately, and resisted internationally within hours. The strategic logic behind the doctrine is easy to summarize, even if it is dangerous to execute. And that logic says America must secure its hemisphere before China and Russia deepen their reach, especially in Latin America, the Arctic, and the maritime lanes that connect global trade to American security. In theory, this is a response to a real problem because Chinese investment in ports and infrastructure, Russian activity in the Caribbean, and competition in the Arctic are all genuine concerns. But real concerns do not automatically produce smart policies, and that is where this doctrine begins to undermine itself. Every time Washington pressures Canada, it weakens the most stable border relationship in North America. Every time it threatens Greenland, it unsettles NATO. Every time it squeezes Cuba, it creates space for Russia, and every time it talks like a territorial conqueror, it gives rivals the perfect argument that America is becoming what it once claimed to oppose. That contradiction is the heart of the story, because the doctrine claims to strengthen security while repeatedly producing the opposite effect. And the more it is pushed, the more it invites resistance, distrust, and strategic backlash from the very countries the United States needs most. The economic consequences are also impossible to ignore, because when America escalates pressure against Canada, it risks the cost of trade disruption with one of its largest economic partners. And when it turns diplomacy into a contest of dominance, It eventually makes American households absorb the price in higher costs, uncertainty, and strained supply chains. Military escalation brings an even heavier burden, because once force becomes part of the conversation, the costs stop being symbolic and become logistical, financial, and human, and the United States is already stretched across multiple commitments, multiple theaters, and multiple political tensions that do not disappear just because a new conflict becomes convenient. For Cuba, the human cost is brutally direct because blackouts do not punish diplomats. They punish children, patients, workers, families, and the elderly. And when ordinary citizens lose power, medicine, transport, safety, and stability, the crisis becomes moral as much as it is geopolitical. For Canada, the damage is more psychological but still profound because being treated like a potential annexation target changes the emotional foundation of a relationship that was supposed to be based on trust, friendship, and mutual benefit. And once that trust is weakened, it is very hard to rebuild. For the United Kingdom, the risk is strategic because Britain's post-Brexit relationship with North America relies heavily on a stable triangle between London, Ottawa, and Washington. And if the American side starts destabilizing the other 2 points, then Britain is forced into a far more complicated world than it wants to manage. For Europe more broadly, this sends a chilling signal. Because if America can publicly speak in territorial terms about allies, then the assumption that Western institutions will always restrain major powers starts to look far less reliable than it once did. And that leads to one of the most important questions in the entire story, which is whether all of this is truly a grand long-term plan or whether it is also driven by domestic political theater, because leaders often use foreign pressure to create strength at home, especially when they want to appear decisive, historic, and larger than the problems surrounding them. Trump's style makes this question even more urgent because he consistently speaks in terms of legacy, image, dominance, and historical greatness, and leaders who think this way often begin to confuse the size of their ambition with the quality of their judgment. He wants to be remembered as transformative, as the man who reordered the system, and when a leader begins chasing that kind of immortality, the temptation is to reach for moves that look dramatic rather than wise, forceful rather than durable, and unforgettable rather than sustainable. But history rarely rewards the loudest conqueror in the way that that conqueror expects, because the leaders who endure most positively are usually the ones who build trust, institutions, peace, and stability, while the leaders who are remembered negatively are the ones who overreach, isolate themselves, and leave a trail of resentment behind them. This is why the world is watching so carefully, because the present moment could become either a brief burst of political theater or the early phase of a deeper strategic realignment. And the difference between those two outcomes will depend on how allies, rivals, and smaller states react under pressure. If allies quietly accept the pressure, the doctrine grows stronger. But if they push back, diversify, coordinate, and refuse to normalize intimidation, then the entire strategy begins to wobble because no empire can expand indefinitely against a wall of resistance without paying an enormous price. That price is already visible in the form of diplomatic strain, humanitarian suffering, market uncertainty, and rising suspicion. And the most dangerous part is that these effects often build slowly until one day the world realizes the old order is already gone and something harsher has replaced it. In that sense, the greatest mistake would be to see each event separately because Cuba, Panama, Canada, Greenland, Venezuela, and Iran are not isolated headlines. They are pieces of the same chessboard, and the position of one piece changes the meaning of every other move. And once you see the whole board, the story becomes much more serious because it stops being about random tension and starts being about architecture, about who gets to define the hemisphere, who gets to set the limits, and who gets to decide whether sovereignty is a rule or a suggestion. The stakes then become global because if one superpower can talk openly about absorbing, reclaiming, or controlling neighboring territory, other powers will begin to learn from that behavior, and the norm against territorial revision gets weaker everywhere, not just in the Americas. That is the nightmare scenario for the modern international order. Because once the idea spreads that borders can be challenged whenever a powerful state feels strategically inconvenienced, then every region becomes more unstable, every alliance becomes more fragile, and every smaller nation becomes more anxious. What happens next may still be uncertain, but the direction of travel is already visible because the world is beginning to recalibrate around the possibility that America's closest partners may not always be treated like partners at all, and that realization alone changes behavior long before a single border ever changes on paper. Governments are already reacting by rethinking trade, defense, energy, and diplomacy because no state wants to rely too heavily on a partner that suddenly speaks the language of possession instead of partnership. And once diversification begins, it usually does not reverse quickly. That means the real long-term cost of this doctrine may not be the immediate crisis, but the slow erosion of trust that makes the United States less central, less relied upon, and less effective in the very system it once dominated. In the end, that could be the deepest irony of all, because a policy designed to assert control may instead accelerate strategic isolation, and a doctrine built to strengthen American power may end up teaching the world how to survive with less of it. So, when people ask where this ends, the honest answer is that it ends only when the pressure stops producing useful results, when allies refuse to comply, when rivals exploit the openings, and when the political cost at home finally outweighs the gain of sounding strong abroad. Until then, the story will keep moving, the rhetoric will keep sharpening, and the world will keep watching every new statement as if it were a clue. Because in a moment like this, even a single sentence from Washington can move markets, panic governments, and reshape expectations across continents. And that is why this is not just a story about Cuba or Panama or Canada or Greenland. It is a story about the future of sovereignty, the future of alliances, the future of American power, and the possibility that the international order is entering one of its most unstable phases in decades. Whether you see this as vision, arrogance, strategy, or dangerous overreach, one thing is undeniable: the language has changed, the stakes have risen, and the map that America is sketching for itself no longer looks like the map the world grew used to after World War II. Before this video ends, I want your thoughts on one question. Do you believe this greater North America vision is a serious long-term strategic blueprint? Or is it mainly a domestic political performance, meant to look strong while creating pressure at home and fear abroad? Because the answer says a lot about where the world may be heading next. If this breakdown gave you value, like the video, share it with someone who follows global politics, comment your opinion below, and subscribe to Market Mindset for more deep, high-intensity analysis that cuts through the noise and gets straight to the real story.